Hey guys, welcome back. I am Chris with Marksman Shooting Sports in Westfield, Indiana, and you are watching Marksman TV. Welcome back to another weekly used gun review. Remember, in these videos, we take 6 firearms that have been brought into our store either through the front door or through our website and give you guys about a 4 to 5 minute review of each to give you guys an idea of some different things out there on the market. Remember, the point of this video is strictly to be entertaining and educational. We are not making this video to sell anything to keep in accordance with YouTube's policies. So with all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and jump into it now. Alright guys, remember the format of this video is we start with most common and move through least common as the video progresses, starting us off with our first spot. Now this one comes to us from a local customer, so thank you so much for selling this one to us. This is a Russian M44 carbine chambered in 7.62 by 54R. It is bolt action and fed from an internal box magazine holding 5 cartridges. It is fed from a stripper clip. There is a stripper clip guide here. And it is most identifiable by a side-mounted bayonet right here on the right-hand side of the carbine. Now this would be Russia's final iteration of the carbine that would serve in the Second World War and a little bit beyond. But where did we come from to get here? Well, the history begins as far back as the Russo-Ottoman War. Now, in that war, the Russians were using their Berdan single-shot rifles, which left them at a little bit of a disadvantage. So following the conclusion of that war in 1882, Russia would put out a solicitation for a new service rifle, of which they would get many applicants. Now, one of the most popular was one set forth by Mosin, which, when the trials would conclude in 1891, his firearm would be selected as the new standard issue rifle in Russia. Now, in 1930, it would see some revisions, giving it the name the 9130, and that is the standard rifle that most of us are familiar with from movies, video games, gun shows, gun shops. That's the one you see all over the place and has been imported into the United States for some time. Now, if we look at the doctrine of a carbine type system, the original 91 rifle was very long. There were second line and ancillary troops that wanted something that would be more maneuverable, more compact, lightweight, and easier to transport so they could spend their time focusing at the task at hand rather than carrying around and shooting a rifle like the general infantry. So in 1907, they would come out with a carbine version of the 91 pattern rifle known as the 1907. It was just like the standard issue rifle, except for it was cut down to more of a carbine length, where the handguard actually most iconically would travel all the way into the end of the sight base. Therefore, it had no provision for a bayonet. Now, if we fast forward to the Russian Civil War, which would conclude in 1924 with the consolidation of Russia under the power of Stalin, Stalin wanted to, in the interwar period, and in Russia we consider the interwar period between the Civil War and the Finnish Winter War of 1939, he wanted to revamp Russia's armaments. So he would do this by first employing a semi-automatic rifles program, of which the SVT-38 and SVT-40 would come out of. He would want to revamp the standard issue bolt action rifle, the Model 91. In 1930, there would be a lot of revisions incorporated on that, such as adding a front sight hood. They would go from the Arshin's measurement on the rear sight to the standard meter measurements found in the rest of Europe, and employ a couple other small revisions to the internal workings of the action, such as the way the magazine, floor plate, and the follower would attach to the rifle, small things like that. Now with that, following a few years later, they wanted to revamp the carbine design. So in about 1937, they would start by taking the 9130 pattern and shortening it, and you were left with the Model 1938. Now, the 1938 was just like the 9130, however, it also, like the 1907 carbine, could not take a bayonet. It would start being used in 1939. It was used in the Finnish Winter War and the early stages of the Second World War. But by 1943, they wanted to revamp the carbine design again with the main purpose of creating a provision for a bayonet. So what they would do, and what actually a lot of other countries did, if you look at the places like Italy with the Carcano carbines, the cavalry carbines, or Japan with the M44 Arisaka, is they would mount a bayonet directly onto the rifle, so it did not need to be carried as a second piece of kit. Now, what they did is they basically took the M38 and added the provision for the bayonet here on the right-hand side, as I mentioned earlier. It is sort of spring-loaded. You pull here, swing it around, and it locks itself in place, making a very handy and usable package. You don't have to worry about losing your bayonet. Now, in order to do that, they added a cut to the stock here so the bayonet could rest when it's not being used. And later M38 carbines that had seen re-arsenaling, they would take M44 stocks, as the rifles are pretty much the same, So a lot of the M38s you see today that have been refurbished have the M44 stock on it. If you find an M38 carbine without this cut in there and it's an original M38 stock, that will add some value. Now these would go in production in 1944 and stay in production in Russia until 1948. They would be produced by Tula for only I believe it was just in 1944 at Tula, but they would be mainly produced at Ijevsk between 1944 and 1948. Now other satellite countries such as Poland or China or Hungary would actually produce the model as well. This particular one was made in Hungary in 1953. Now, there were millions of these manufactured, and they are not very hard to find. You can find them at gun shows and gun shops, although they are increasing in value. Typically between $300 and $500 is where you find them. This particular one has virtually all of its finishes gone. It's got a nice stock and barrel, though, and it is mismatched, so somewhat of a shooter, so this would be sort of to the lower end of that. But anyway, very nice rifles, very fun to shoot and fun to collect. So that is going to start us off on this video, the M44 carbine. Okay, up next is a very interesting rifle and a favorite of mine. This is a Ptr Industries Ptr 91 chambered in 308. This particular one is the GI version, known by having the green furniture. This one also has provisions for an optic in the rear, but you can get that without that optic rail if you want to use a standard HK style claw mount. Now this one comes to us from a local customer, so thank you so much for selling this one to us. What we have here is a domestic manufactured civilian version of the German G3, or we could say a domestic manufactured version of the HK91. And I'll explain a little bit about what that means. Now, if we go back to the 1950s, arms designers had learned some important lessons from the Second World War. One of those was that the semi-automatic rifle was the dominant player in the battlefield. This was things like the M1 Garand, or the Russian SVT-38 and SVT-40, or the German G43. So as arms designers would move through the 1950s post-war, they would take this type of concept and develop what would later be known as the battle rifle configuration. That is the standard full-size rifle, shoulder-fired, feeding from a detachable box magazine, chambered in a full-powered rifle cartridge in either semi or fully automatic configuration. This would lead into things like the Set-Me-C, the German G3, the FAL, the M14. Those would all sort of fit into the battle rifle configuration. Now, at the time in the 1950s, there was a very famous arms designer in Germany known as Ludwig von Grimmler. He had been employed by Spain to help them develop their new battle rifle in the 1950s, of which he successfully developed the Set-Me Model C, which looked a lot like this, but there was a paddle-type rear sight, and it was known for having the iconic wood furniture. So that's the quickest way you can identify a Set-Me pattern, as well as the bayonet mounted a little bit differently up here at the front end. Now, Germany had been noticing what was going on with the Set-Me-C, and they wanted a German domestic version of their own. So Ludwig von Grimmler would go back to Germany, help them develop their own configuration off of the Set-Me-C pattern, and they would land on what was adopted as the G3. As mentioned, they would move to polymer furniture, lightening the load. They would kind of remove the Spanish-style bayonet mounting system, and they would go with a diopter rear drum type sight, which are the quickest ways to identify the German pattern. And it was, of course, select fire, chambered in 7.62 NATO. Now, this would actually stay in German service through the Bundeswehr for quite some time, and because of that, it would lead to popularity and desire for this pattern of rifle on the U.S. commercial market. Now, HK had developed a civilian export version known as the HK91, which would come into the United States between the mid and late 1980s. Now, unfortunately, in 1989, there was sort of a wet rag thrown on the importation of firearms due to the George Bush Sr. importation restrictions of 1989, which stated that imported firearms had to have a sporting purpose. This is where you see things like the Mac 90 with the thumbhole stocks and things like that, so they would effectively stop coming in about that time. Now, a few short years later, we have the 1994 assault weapons ban under President Bill Clinton, which would further put issues on the manufacture of things like this that would serve in the civilian market. Now, all the way up until we get to 2002, there was a company known as JLD, named after the founder, Jose Luis Diaz. What he had done is he had gone to Portugal and had purchased some of the tooling and schematics for the HK pattern of rifles that they had contracts for manufacture. He would manufacture those domestically with ban-compliant parts such as no bayonet lugs, no muzzle brakes, and things like that. Now, those would be manufactured through the end of the assault weapons ban, which would sunset in 2004, and he would get back to very quickly coming out with a post-ban compliant or a standard non-bastardized, if you will, configuration of the German G3 or the HK91, if you will. Now, a couple years after that, there was a company known as Ptr Industries, and they had gone to Jose Luis Diaz and asked, basically solicited him to purchase his company JLD, which they had done. Now, by 2005, Ptr Industries is basically up and running as a new founder. Mr. Diaz had actually stayed on with the company to help them, and they had started off by using a bunch of surplus HK and G3 surplus parts. Now, by about 2010, they were pretty well self-sufficient on manufacturing everything from the ground up, except for things like furniture and magazines, which are still readily available and inexpensive, but every other part in these rifles is new manufactured. These are still manufactured. Today, they make a huge array of different versions of the pattern, but the GI series, in my opinion, is one of the kind of the true to its original form, especially if you get it without the scope rail, which is why this one's sort of my favorite configuration. Now, used on the market today, you're finding these around $900 to $1,100. Used and new, typically these have been in about the $1,200 to $1,300 range, depending on when and where you find them. But they are very, very nice, very durable rifles. And again, those magazines are super inexpensive, and so is the furniture. So, very cool rifle. I always like seeing these, and I'm happy to get them in. It is a Ptr Industries Ptr 91 GI. Okay, up next is an interesting revolver, and this one is sort of an interesting cog in the whole Colt revolver dynamic that was happening around, the early 1900s. This is a Colt model Army Special of 1908, and this one is chambered in 3220. Now, the story with this really begins back in 1892. By 1889, Colt had been working on the new swing-out cylinder type of technology. Now, prior to that, they had been using the single-action Army, where the cylinder was more or less stationary, meant to stay inside the firearm through use, other than for maintenance and cleaning, where you had a side-loading gate that would open and you would pop in your rounds. Single-action pull on the hammer to fire, and then when empty, you would open the gate and then push the spent rounds out through an ejector rod. You can look up Colt Single Action Armies on YouTube kind of to see the function of that. Now, that was the sort of fixed cylinder approach, was becoming outdated by the late 1800s, and again by 1889 they had been working on the traditional swing out cylinder that we all know today, where you can pop out the cylinder, eject your spent casings, load in your additional 6 rounds or 5 rounds depending on the revolver, close the cylinder, and then commence firing, also in double single action. Now, by 1892, Colt had put out their first real commercially successful side mount or side swinging cylinder revolver, which was the 1892 Colt Navy and Colt Army revolvers chambered in 38 Colt. Now, this was intended for the United States military, and it was popular. It was a very good design. However, in the Filipino campaign fighting against the Spanish Moros, it was found that the 38 caliber round was too anemic. So very quickly, the United States military had tried to bring back old 1873 peacemakers back into military service using the 45 Colt round, which was more potent and had much more stopping power and lethality. Due to that, in the late 1800s, Colt would put out the Colt New Service in the 45 cartridge with the new swing-out cylinder, had positive lockup, and was very, very popular, and would very quickly start to see a lot of military service. Now, in 1908, Colt is looking to, obviously, because they already have a foothold in the United States military, they do have a lot of use with law enforcement as well. They're looking at revamping law enforcement use as well as getting into the commercial market with a new swing-out technology. And a lesser caliber, it's not really necessary for police forces and civilians to be carrying around the new potent, or I shouldn't say new, but the more potent and powerful military 45 round. So it would come out with the similar principles of the Colt New Service, but in a scaled down package, which was released in 1908 as the Army Special, which is this. Now, because it would see some use with the commercial markets as well as law enforcement, it was offered in 3 barrel lengths, the 4, the 5, and the 6 inch, offered in 22 LR, 3220, which actually is what this is, 38, 38 200, and 41 Colt. Now, it was believed that at the time, even though militaries are moving on to the 45 caliber, at least in the United States, law enforcement is still using a 32 caliber round, so scaling up to 38 would give them a foothold in the United States police department market, which it really did, and it did very well. Again, it saw a lot of use commercially as well. Now, being that it was named the Army Special, it was going off of sort of the principles of the Colt New Service. hoping to appeal to an Army application as well for, MP and ancillary backline type forces who don't need the more potent round, but it really did not see that much use within military service. And honestly, just a year later, by 1909, the Colt News Service was the new officially adopted revolver, which it itself would be replaced a few years later by the Colt 1911 and 45 ACP. Now, as we have the emergence of things like the 1911 and semi-automatic pistol technology, things like this are going to start falling out of favor as well. Now, an interesting sort of pivot into a new popular line of revolvers for Colt for the police market. As this was not really faring well in military service and for military application, it was doing well with civilians. Where it was seeing a lot of use was in the police departments. So in 1927, they would make a couple alterations to this revolver, such as they would checker the trigger, they would add matte finishing to the top and back straps, and then they would widen the rear sight aperture gutter, if you will. And they would officially rename this the Official Police. So a lot of you know what an Official Police revolver is. It served very well up until about the time of World War II or so. And this is actually officially where it began. And this is the original sort of variation of the Official Police line. If we're looking at the commercial market today on where these are priced, they are not unobtainable in terms of price, typically between $300 and $500, depending on condition. If you get really, really premium condition and like 38 caliber or something like that, I've seen them top upwards of $7, but by and large, I see most of them hovering around the $500 mark. So anyway, very, very cool revolver. Happy to get this one in and share it with you guys. And again, this one did come to us from another local customer. So we'll move on to the next one. Okay, up next is a pretty interesting little 22 caliber revolver from Smith & Wesson, and it has been known by many names over the years as it has evolved. Now, first it was known as the 2232 kit gun, then it was the improved 2232 model of 1953, then it's been known as the Model 34. It's also gone by the name as the Pre-34 or the pre-war Model 1934, so it's got obviously seen some evolutionary changes. Now, in 1910, the story really begins with a San Francisco gun dealer named Phil Beckert. He had approached Smith & Wesson with this concept of taking what was known at the time as the I-frame 32 caliber hand-eject revolvers, which, remember, in the 1890s-ish, that's when we're really moving into the swing-out cylinder type of concept, the small concealed carrier, small defensive 32 caliber revolvers, which are actually used in police service as well, which we just discussed, were pretty popular. So by 1910, he has the idea of using the same frame size, the I-frame, but using it in a 22 caliber for like camping, hiking, defense type purposes, or for target use, which is where we get the term kit gun, which is to be included as a piece of kit for your hiking or outdoor equipment. So by 1910, he had solicited Smith & Wesson, who agreed to put in an order of 1,000 units for him. Now, by about 1914, these would actually start really going into production, and they had actually only produced about 292 units of those 1,000 units because Phil Beckert was not actually seeing a lot of success on the market with this concept, I-frame and 22 caliber. Now, they would more or less shelve this idea and this concept until about the 1930s, when a lot of Smith & Wesson customers are coming forward and saying, hey, we would really like a small frame 22 caliber revolver for hiking defense against small game or for target use. Well, Smith & Wesson had already had Phil Beckert's idea and concept in their catalog, so they decided to go ahead and reintroduce it. Now, this period of manufacturing is known as the pre-war Model 34 specifically, or the pre-war Model 2232. 2232, by the way, being 22 caliber built on the 32 caliber I-frame. Now, these would actually see a lot of success, and they would be produced up until the beginning of World War II. Remember, in the United States, when World War II would begin, there would be a lot of requirement for the United States government to produce war material for the war effort, so these sort of civilian-type commercial firearms were more or less shelved. Now, they did have a lot of these in inventory completed, and they had a lot of parts left over from the Second World War, so when the Second World War would conclude in the 1950s, they would get back to putting these back out on the commercial market. So you could have pre-war models and pre-war parts that were left over, and then sold as the new models from the 1950s, and those are the so-called Transitional 2232 or Transitional Model 37 Smith & Wesson revolvers. Now in 1953, they would come out with an improved model. They would change a couple things about the inner working. The I-frame grip was extended, the mainspring was altered, they would alter the rear sight. And they would reintroduce this again in 1953 as a 2232 improved 53 model, or model of 1953, which is what this is. Now, on those earlier models that I had talked about, they had actually kept up the serialization with the other I-frame 32 revolvers that were in production with Smith & Wesson, so those are typically in the 50,000 range or so. But with the 53 model, they would restart at serial number 101. This one is actually serial number 19,000 and some change. So again, this would be known as it's a post-war model, but pre-34. Where do we get pre-34? Well, through about the mid-1950s, that's when Smith & Wesson starts taking their models that they had in their catalog and assigning the numerical model system that we all know today through their modeling. Now, they had redubbed the 2232 as the Model 34 in 1957. So therefore, right inside the cylinder crane, they would mark it 34, which is where you find the model numbers on Smith & Wessons today. This is not marked that way, so again, that is why you would call it a pre-Model 34. Now, in 1960, they would redesign the package again, going to the larger J-frame. So the J-frame is the small concealed carry frame you see on like 642s and 442s today. So it would beef up the design, and then they would redesignate that the 34-1, and then the 34s would therefore stay in production until about 1991 when they would be discontinued. So a really interesting firearm that really follows along the lines of history of model designations and manufacturing from the early 1900s post-World War II to the 1950s when they start giving them model designations, and then manufactured all the way through the 1990s. So really, really cool piece of history. So there are a lot of collectors on these, even today as a utilitarian piece, very small, easy to conceal, take with you hiking or backpacking, or as an interesting target pistol, or as a Smith & Wesson collectible, which is what most people are going to get them for today. Now on the market today, the pricing varies very heavily depending on which variation and model it is. As a pre-37, it's going to have a little bit more value to it, but you know, this one's actually got a lot of wear on it, some muzzle wear. This is probably 80% condition, and things like this you typically find at about the $500 plus range. Excellent condition ones top up, I've seen around 7 or 8, and then excellent condition with original box and everything, I've seen top up over 1,000. If you get the early 1930s models, those are of course going to demand more of a premium. And if you find one of the really, really early, you know, 1911-ish, 1911 to 1914 manufacture, those are going to be the most valuable, as those are the most rare. But anyway, very interesting revolver. Happy to get in and share it with you. Okay, up next I have a very interesting rifle. This one coming to us from a viewer in Arizona. So thank you so much for selling this one to us. This is a Romanian Ames 74. Specifically, this is an Atlantic Arms manufactured battlefield pickup built on a Morrissey receiver. And I'll explain a little bit about that as we get through it. But first, the history on this. So Romanian has always used, or I shouldn't say always, but when the Soviet Union would get into the new AKM type pattern, Romania would always follow suit pretty closely, coming up with their own designs. You guys have seen the Walther 10s and the early SAR 1 and 2 and the WUMs that have been coming out on the market since the 1990s. They're probably the most common and most available AK pattern available today commercially, and one of the kind of final holdouts for imported AKs. And they are very good patterns. They are not directly linked or directly related to the Soviet pattern of AK. They've always sort of put their own type of spin on their platform. Now, in the 1970s, of course, Russia would move from the 7.62x39 cartridge to the 5.45x39 with the AK-74 type pattern. Now, Russia would always encourage all of its related satellite-type countries to follow suit in its development of arms and munitions so that there was commonality of parts and cartridges and stuff like that. So in the 1980s, Romania would follow suit and also adopt the 5.45x39. However, they did not just take the Soviet pattern of the AK-74. They really tried to create their own design, which is more or less this configuration. Now, if you take a standard AKM and reconfigure it for the 5.45x39 cartridge, you have essentially what the Romanians had done with the Ames 74, or technically what they adopted as the PA-86 in 1986. So you have the rear trunnion that can take the side-folding crutch type stock. It uses the original AKM type gas block, and even the front end, even though it has the traditional AK-74 pattern type of muzzle device on it, it is a little bit longer, and also the thread pattern is different. Traditional in most countries 24 millimeter. This is a 22 millimeter. So if you want to do a conversion, make sure you actually get the original Ames or the MD86 or PA86, excuse me, type of muzzle brake. Now, several years ago, the parts kits for these started coming into the country. Now, Romania actually, and kind of differentiate between what a PA86 and an Ames 74 is the PA86 was the militarily adopted configuration. They did have the export version of the rifle, which they knew as the Ames 74. On a fixed stock, it would just be AIM, AIM 74. S is for the side-folding stock, Ames 74. The parts kits would come into the country, and they did about 4 or 5 years ago, and they were pretty widely available. Companies like Atlantic Firearms would take the kits and build them on US-made receivers and barrels, which is what they've done here, and then sell them through their websites. Now, unfortunately, lately the parts kits for these have dried up, and the parts kits alone are exploding in price, let alone a complete built firearm, making this right now at the present time a little bit uncommon. But that, of course, will change if more AIM 74 kits come into the market. Now, what makes this specifically, there are a couple characteristics specific to this that makes it an AIM 74 or a PA86. Now, remember, the PA86 is a select fire firearm, actually also incorporating a 3-round burst variation, which makes it a little bit more complicated and prone to malfunctions than the original AK-74 pattern, which is just save, semi, and full auto. But on an AIM 74 or PA86, you're going to have the side folding stock. The Romanians went with a push button folding, let's see, there we go, folding over here to the right hand side of the receiver, as opposed to a latch system used by a lot of other countries. You do have the dong vertical grip here with a Bakelite top handguard. Bakelites would be correct for this, not wood. Also a Bakelite pistol grip, which this has a US pistol grip on it, but kind of has the same type of look and feel. The charging handle on this, you might notice, is upswept. If you guys are catching that, up to about a 45-degree angle. The reason they did that is so when the stock is closed, you can actually get that and access it without risking running your hand into the stock as folded. And then the other final difference, as noted, is the 22 millimeter flash hider or muzzle device up here at the front. So with those characteristics, that makes it really an AIM 74. You can take an early SAR Romanian AK and convert it with those parts or any other AK type pattern based on the 545 cartridge and replace it with these parts, which you might be able to find loose floating around on the market, and do your own type of build. But for something that somebody wants an actual AIM 74 parts kit built and ready to go, this was sort of the way to go with them. I remember several years ago when these were coming in, Atlantic was selling these for about $800 or $900 because the kits have dried up. On their website, they have these advertised at about $12. They call them either the Battlefield Pickup, which is what this is. These are new receivers and barrels, but they wear them down to match the wear patterns of the kit and make it look like it's picked right up off the battlefield. Or they have a version where they're like completely blued and refinished and look nice and new. Those are a little bit more expensive, but typically they're selling them for around $1,200. When they are in stock, they're usually out of stock, so they're on the used market actually going up over that, just again because the kits are really hard to find. But anyway, there's that one. Just interesting. I did a build myself into this type of configuration with an SAR rifle. I got everything done except for the front end because these front side assembly and muzzle brake assembly was hard to find. But anyway, very interesting. Happy to get that in and share with you guys. Okay, last but not least, we have a pretty rare pistol. Now, this is a Walther Ppk, and the Ppk in and of itself is not uncommon. But this is a pretty rare variation of it, and I'll explain as we go through this. But first, let's talk about a little bit about the history of this pistol. Now, in the 19-teens and the 1920s, there was a lot of demand and a lot of interest in small frame pocket carry, if you will, concealed carry pistols. There are such dominant players on the market in Germany and in the rest of Europe for that matter, such as the Walther No. 4, there's the Mauser 1910 and 1914, the Sauer 32 caliber semi-automatic pistol. So by the 1920s, late 1920s, Walther is wanting to revamp their concealed carry line, and they would come out with a really revolutionary design known as the Walther PP, the police pistol chambered in 32 automatic. Now, through the early 1930s, it would see huge success with the commercial and the police markets in Germany, so they would want to come out with an even smaller, more compact version by cutting down the barrel and the grip, losing one round in the magazine, and they would release this as the PPK, Police Pistol Criminal model, and it would also see a tremendous amount of success through the 1930s. Now, by 1939, Germany is heavily getting involved, or is involved in the Second World War, what would become the global Second World War, and they would want to fold in a lot of good equipment, good firearms into German military service, either purchased privately as commercial firearms or issued officers and things like that. So you would see PPs and PPKs folded into German military service. Now, in 1945, we all know Germany would lose the war, and because of that, they would be ordered by the Allies to cease production on military arms and equipment. So Walther would have to cease production on their firearms, which would include the PP, the PPK, the P38, and things like that. Manurin in France would license production with Walther to maintain production of the PP pistols, most notably, as well as P1s. And they would produce those for German and for French police use and things like that. Now, through the 1950s, Walther would actually resume production in Ulm in Germany. And again, these would continue to see a lot of success. Now, there is a growing demand on the United States commercial market, again, for small frame concealed carry pistols. So Walther would want to start exporting these firearms into the United States market, which they would do through the 1950s and 60s. Now, in 1968 in the United States, we have the passing of the 1968 GCA, the Gun Control Act, which would put limitations on small frame firearms that could come into the U.S. commercial market as imports. They would employ what was known as a point system, where they would take things like the size and the weight of the firearm, the caliber, and they would apply points to the different elements. The firearm had to achieve a certain point number or higher to be able to be accepted for importation. Now, the standard model PPK fell 1 point short of being allowed for importation, so they had to slightly redesign the pistol, in which they did by putting the PPK slide and barrel on a PPK frame, which held one more round. It was the larger frame. It gave it enough size and weight to get it over that extra point threshold, and then the PPK-S could now be imported into the commercial market. It should be actually the end of German manufactured PPKs to come into the United States. Now, they would work with Inner Arms for importation, but as that began to get more expensive, they would look for domestic manufacturing. So Inner Arms would partner with Ranger, a local company in Georgia, to manufacture them. Then they would get a partnership with Smith & Wesson, who would manufacture them. And then lately, Walther now has arms manufacturing in the United States, and they make them there. Now, going back to what makes this a little bit unique. This was manufactured in Germany in 2000, but this is a PPK. How did it end up in the United States? Furthermore, if it were imported by Inner Arms, which was the primary importer of the PPK pistols, or PP pistols, or the German pistols in general, or the Walther pistols, it would be marked on this side with the Inner Arms import mark, but this does not have that either. So we have a non-import marked German manufactured PPK made in 2000 in the US market, which makes this actually very, very, very rare and hard to actually come by, and very few of these would be here. I looked online and I tried to find out an answer to this, and the only thing I could come up with is there are a couple people who have post-68 PPKs in the United States, and what they had found is potentially U.S. service members who had been stationed in Germany may have picked these up locally, commercially, somehow, and then brought them home. And that's really the only explanation I can find. When we look at the market on something like this, there's actually only one other I have found that sold at auction in 2018. It was also a 2000 manufacturer, exact same finish, in its original box. It only had one magazine. It was in the similar type of condition, which on this is excellent. And that one sold for $2,200, and that was 4 years ago. So I have no idea what this would go for today, but it's very unique and interesting, and there's potentially very, very, very few of these actually here. The one, by the way, I saw at auction was 15 digits lower in serial number. So maybe the person who bought this bought that one too. I have no idea. But anyway, because of the importation restrictions, that makes this one kind of curious, and that's why I wanted to share it on this video. Well, that is all the time I have for you today on these. Thank you so much for stopping by and checking out this video. If you enjoyed, please let me know by hitting that like button. Please also consider subscribing to my channel and hit that bell notification button so you are aware when we are posting new content. I'm going to leave you guys off with that. I am Chris with Marksman Shooting Sports in Westfield, Indiana. You are watching Marksman TV, and I will see you next time.